All right, so President Joe Biden made a pretty interesting announcement a couple days ago that he is going to be redeploying U.S. troops, ground forces, into Somalia to go fight the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab that has connections to Al-Qaeda. So we're going to get into some of the details here, but first off, just at face value, how many Americans do you think are aware of the fact that we even have any U.S. troop presence whatsoever in Somalia or in any of the other number of countries that we are engaging in these smaller scale conflicts in? I think the answer to that would, taking a wild guess here, probably be less than at least 20%, if not 10% of the American people that are even aware that this type of a war is being fought. So, we didn't vote for this, we didn't approve of this, but it's all basically being done under the same 2002 authorization for the use of military force that was used to justify the U.S. invading Afghanistan, and now is basically 2 decades later still being used to justify any counterterrorism measures that the U.S. military wants to engage in around the world. So on the specifics of this one here from the New York Times, they say Biden approves plan to redeploy several hundred ground forces into Somalia, and the president also signed off on targeting about a dozen Shabaab leaders in the war-torn country from which Donald J. Trump largely withdrew in his final weeks in office. So yes, Donald Trump in this specific instance did push for this withdrawal from U.S. presence, or withdrawal in a large part of U.S. presence from Somalia, but let's not pretend like Trump is any sort of an anti-war president. We know exactly who he is. He escalated the drone wars, he escalated the airstrikes, and actually reduced the ability for the U.S. military to even track or keep track of civilian casualties in the drone strikes that we have been engaging in under his administration. So definitely not an anti-war president, but nonetheless, Biden is reversing his decision on this specific issue. And they say here, President Biden has signed an order authorizing the military to once again deploy hundreds of special operations forces inside Somalia, largely reversing the decision by President Trump to withdraw nearly all 700 ground troops who had been stationed there, according to 4 U.S. officials familiar with the matter. And they say, in addition, Mr. Biden has approved a Pentagon request for standing authority to target about a dozen suspected leaders of Al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist group that is affiliated with Al-Qaeda, 3 of the officials said. And since Mr. Biden took office, airstrikes have largely been limited to those meant to defend partner forces facing an immediate threat. So very vague. And of course, the recording of these airstrikes is often either lied about or misconstrued or covered up from analysis from the public or from media sources. So, again, not exactly a credible source here to be relying on with these anonymous U.S. State Department officials, but they continue here saying, together, the decisions by Mr. Biden, described by the officials on the condition of anonymity, will revive an open-ended American counterterrorism operation that has amounted to a slow burn war through 3 administrations, and the move stands in contrast to his decision last year to pull American forces from Afghanistan, saying that it is time to end the forever wars. And this is something that he repeated many times on the campaign trail, and once he was elected and took office, is he said he was going to be the guy who was going to bring an end to the forever wars. And of course, if you know anything about the history of Joe Biden and his time under the Obama administration or in the Senate, this guy is almost more responsible than any other a political figure still around in the United States for these forever wars in the first place. So, the idea that he was legitimately going to end U.S. military presence around the world with our over 800 military bases and over 200,000 American troops that are stationed overseas, the idea that he was going to be the guy who comes into office and starts to reduce the capacity of the U.S. military is pretty laughable if you, again, understand the history of who Joe Biden is. But they give us a little bit more details here, saying Ms. Watson did not indicate the number of troops the military would deploy, but 2 people familiar with the matter said that the figure would be capped at around 450, and that will replace a system in which the U.S. troops training and advising Somali and African Union forces have made short stays since Mr. Trump issued what Ms. Watson described as a precipitous decision to withdraw. And they say the Biden administration's strategy in Somalia is to try to reduce the threat from Al-Shabaab by suppressing its ability to plot and carry out complicated operations, a senior administration official said. And those include a deadly attack on an American airbase at Manda Bay in Kenya in January 2020. So again, this is kind of part of the whole circular nature of what these forever wars are. I mean, a more fundamental question here wouldn't be, are these al-Shabaab terrorists posing a threat to U.S. troops? It's not that. I mean, listen, the base that they attacked, I don't like that it got attacked or that they killed any people, but, why do we have a base in the first place stationed in Kenya? I mean, that's a more fundamental question of the U.S. military apparatus and our presence around the world in all of these different military bases and installations that we have in order to impose U.S. Global hegemonic military control over all of these different countries. I mean, that's a more fundamental question, but they don't really ask that question at all. And they say, in particular, the official said, targeting a small leadership cadre, especially people who are suspected of playing roles in developing plots outside Somalia's border or having special skills. Kind of weird, the phrasing on this, kind of very vague, but they say it is aimed at curtailing the threat to a level that is tolerable. So again, the language that they use here is intentionally vague. The threat to a level that is tolerable, what the fuck does that mean? I mean, what are the actual threats that al-Shabaab poses to the homeland here in the United States? What are the threats that you're talking about? What would that threat level of tolerability, what would that actually look like in a real material way that you could track and try to gauge what our success level is on that effort? But they don't do that. They don't provide any actual specifics to this, and that's intentional because not only do they not want us to understand the nature of what the United States is doing in all of these countries that we're engaging in these covert wars in, not only do they not want us to understand it, but they don't want to set up standards that they then have to abide by. Why? Because they are not competent at doing these types of things. They're not competent at actually suppressing terrorist groups around the world. In fact, you could say the United States, with our actions in, the under the Reagan administration or the Nixon administration or the Carter administration, etc., you could argue that we were directly responsible for the formation of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, which is where this al-Shabaab terrorist group has direct connections to. So it's like we're not exactly competent at engaging in, counterterrorism measures in order to suppress the risk to the global community. If anything, our involvement in the Middle East, our involvement in Africa has mostly just led to an increase of hatred and radicalization against the United States because of our presence there in the first place. So again, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. It's a cycle that the military-industrial complex loves to have in place so that they can continue profiting all of these different ventures that the United States is covertly involved in. So finally, they give a little bit of a critique here, saying some outside analysts criticize the move, including Sarah Harrison, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, who is the lead author of an upcoming report on U.S. policy in Somalia. This should be interesting to see. But the United States has been trying to curb al-Shabaab using military force for 15 years, and it had not worked, she said. It might have even prolonged the conflict, which again is somewhat kind of the goal here, at least from the perspective of, military industrial complex weapons manufacturers who profit off of this prolonged war that the U.S. is engaged in all of these different countries. But they had a direct quote here from her saying, sending in more U.S. troops and homing in on a small number of senior al-Shabaab leadership is narrow in its aims and by definition cannot end the broader military fight absent more concerted and effective diplomatic, not military, diplomatic and political efforts by the United States and others. So again, the real fundamental questions that people should be asking is, why are we involved in Somalia in the first place? Why do we have, troop presence in all of these other countries? Like here from Defense One, they point out the numerous countries that the U.S. is involved in some form of war right now in, and this is, just what the Pentagon is officially acknowledging. So it's not even a complete list here, but, involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Niger, all under the same banner of, again, that 2002 authorization for the use of military force to fight Al-Qaeda-linked militants. And again, the fundamental questions that need to be asked is, why are we doing this? Is this even effective? And they can't answer those fundamental questions. And really, I don't even think they want to have an answer to those questions, because this is more so about projecting American strength, projecting our military presence in Africa, in the Middle East. It's more about that power and creating that U.S. omnipresent force across the world. It's more about that than it is about creating safety for the American people. This is not making us safer necessarily, okay? This is just, again, again, part of this decades-long project of trying to enforce our will on the global community and getting involved in affairs that we very clearly have a demonstrated inability to effectively handle or to effectively resolve these situations using anything other than just violence and military presence and occupation and invasion and covert operations, etc. So we're not even effective at doing this in the first place. And again, this is basically just the policy of the U.S. This broad-ranging involvement in smaller ways in all of these other countries, the 7 that we just discussed there. But just to put it in a different perspective in terms of how widespread the use of military force is under the same 2002 authorization, here from Salon, they point out that the U.S. drops an average of 46 bombs a day. That's over the last 2 decades. Why should the world see us as a force for peace? And I think the answer to that is they shouldn't, because that's not the goal. The goal of the U.S. military is not to spread democracy around the world, okay? It's not to, spread peace through force, which is a common phrase the U.S. military likes to use. That's not the goal of the U.S. military. That's not the goal of the U.S. government at all. The goal is to, again, project our strength around the world, to, have economic and military dominance over regions that U.S. multinational corporations and the weapons manufacturers that profit from these wars are going to use to their advantage. That's the goal. It's projecting American hegemonic control over the entire world. This is why we have a military budget that is larger than the next 11 countries combined, most of which are allies. This is why we have 800 plus military bases around the world and those hundreds of thousands of troops stationed all around the world. It's just to project U.S. hegemonic control over the entire global community. We are the world's police force, and I think that that's very obviously, in a demonstrable way, if you want to look at all of our different involvements in these regions, it's a bad thing. I mean, it's bad in the sense that it's destabilizing these regions. It's bad in the sense that we have a proven track record of siding with terrorist groups and allowing them to come to prominence in the first place. It's also bad from the perspective of the safety of the American people. I mean, do you really think that the U.S. military is going to be effective in suppressing terrorism in Somalia in a long-term sustained way? No, I mean, of course they're not. No, they're not actually protecting the U.S. homeland from external security threats that weren't created by the United States military and our ventures overseas. So that's what I want to get you guys to understand at a fundamental level. This is not about safety. It's not about counterterrorism. This is about projection of strength and continuing this self-fulfilling prophecy, this cycle that only serves to benefit U.S. multinational corporations, capitalists, and the military-industrial complex lackeys, the politicians and the weapons manufacturers who are profiting off of these endless forever wars that Biden promised to end and is very clearly not interested in actually ending.